Yes, they do still play football in Alabama. I don't live far from Tuscaloosa, and I'd have a lot more to say about that, but I'm a Georgia fan, so I can commiserate with all the LSU fans. Every year loaded with talent, every year can't beat Alabama. So I'm there with you on that one. Thank you for the meal. That was really, really good. I enjoyed that. Second breakfast I've had today, and both of them were excellent. However, I know my challenge, because you have just eaten a full meal, and it's Sunday afternoon. Yeah. So I'm aware of my challenge, and I'm watching you, okay? Just know I'm watching you. I love the story about the man that always fell asleep during the sermon, and it embarrassed his wife, especially the snoring. It embarrassed his wife, and so one Sunday she decided she was going to cure him forever. She took an onion, cut it in half, put one half in a plastic bag, put that in her purse, and then as soon as the sermon started, he settled in, and sure enough, he was out like a light. And so she was going to fix him. She took that onion and she just stuck it right up under his nose while he was asleep and inhaling deeply. But it backfired on her, because in his half awake, half asleep state, he actually yelled out during the sermon, "Wake up, Ethel, you got your feet on my pillow." Well, I'm watching you, and I hope you'll stay with me. How does God feel about sinners? How does God feel about sinners? That's the point that Jesus was making in Luke chapter 15. I invite you to go ahead and turn there. As you're turning to Luke 15, you bring you up to speed on the context. Jesus had been associating with sinners. He was associating with people who were not godly, who were not living as they should have been, and who were sinners. And because of that, there were those who were religious, and they saw this, and from that they concluded that he must not be the Son of God. I mean, after all, God wouldn't associate with sinners, right? I mean, God is holy, God hates sin, and so God would not associate with sinners. And the fact that Jesus did associate with sinners in their minds meant he was not the Son of God. Well, Jesus knew what they were saying. He knew what they were thinking. And so in Luke chapter 15, he began to tell 3 parables. He told 3 stories, and each of them with the same purpose in mind, and that is to show us how God really feels about a sinner. You see, he told one story about the man who had a lost sheep. You remember that? The man had 100 sheep. Only one of them was lost, and yet what did that shepherd do? He left the 99 and he went and found that one, because one lost is important to God. And in fact, he makes the point, just in case they didn't get it, he makes the point in verse 7, Luke 15:7, I tell you, in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over that one sinner who repents than over the 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. And so for these self-righteous people who were criticizing Jesus for associating with sinners, Jesus is saying to their face, God is actually more concerned about that one lost than all of you who think you're saved. Then he tells a second story, the lost coin. There was a widow. She had 10 coins. Notice how the percentage changes. The first person had 1% lost. The second story focuses on a woman who was missing 10% of her assets. Now we're talking more significant, right? But still just as concerning to God. So when this coin was missing, 1 out of 10, she searched the house, she swept the room, she lit lights, and she found that one coin. And then when she found that one coin, what did she do? She rejoiced. And again, he says in verse 10, in the same way I tell you, there's joy in the presence of the angels of heaven when one sinner repents. And then he told a third story. And this is the most famous story. This was the lost boy. We had a lost sheep, a lost coin, a lost son. 1%, 10%, and now 50% lost. But the point's always the same. How does God feel about the lost? How does God feel about a sinner? And he tells this story, and you know the story so well, I'm not actually even going to tell you the story. We're going to be reading parts of it, but you know the story of the prodigal son. What I want us to do this afternoon, though, is maybe think about it in a little bit different way, and that is think about it from the prodigal's standpoint. We're going to be looking at some surprises that this young man must have experienced, some things that happened that he didn't expect would happen. Anytime anyone chooses the prodigal path to go away, there are going to be some surprises. And this afternoon we're going to look at a few of those surprises. Surprise number one must have been how easy it was to leave. Can you imagine this young man going in to ask his father for something huge, like half of his inheritance, up front? I mean, there's a number of reasons why this would not have been done. Number one, it was incredibly rude. I mean, you ask your parents for your share of their inheritance, you're essentially saying, I can't wait for you to die, go ahead and give it to me now. Also, it would never have been done because he wasn't the older brother. The older always had preference and would have gotten their inheritance first, and then the younger, and then the younger, and so forth. And here he is, the youngest, and he's asking for his first. So everything about this request was wrong, and everything about it just completely, elicited a no from the father. But he asked anyway. Now, you know how it is when you're getting ready to ask someone for something, and you're pretty sure they're going to say no. You always have a plan B in mind, right? Well, I'm going to say this, and they're going to say no, and I'm going to come back with this. That's probably what he would have done. And so he goes into his father, and verse 11 says, this man had two sons. The younger of them said, Father, give me the share of the inheritance that falls to me. And he asked him, and I imagine he's expecting a no, right? He had every right to expect a no. Perhaps he's getting ready for plan B, the second speech, the rebuttal argument, but it's not necessary because the father just immediately did it. Now, he would not have expected that. No one would have expected that. The first listeners would never have expected this. What a surprise, how easy it was to leave. The father divided up his inheritance, and suddenly, overnight, he has more than he's ever had before, and he leaves. What you and I need to understand is that our Father doesn't want us to leave. No, any more than this man wanted his son to do what he did. And yet, God won't keep us against our will. You see, if you want to leave God, you can. He is not going to force you to stay. And even though He wants us to, God didn't make robots. He allowed us to have choices. And the reason is, God would receive no joy and no glory if we served Him only because we had no choice but to serve Him. I mean, what joy would that bring Him? I'm serving you, God, but it's only because I have no other choice but to serve you. Can you imagine, some of you have adult children and grandchildren, can you imagine that there's one Christmas, time of year at Christmas, and your children don't want to come visit you and bring the grandchildren? And so you threaten them? If you don't come for Christmas, I'm going to shoot you in the leg, burn your yard, kidnap the grandchildren. And they say, okay, well, we'll be there. How enjoyable is that experience going to be on Christmas Day? Not real great, huh? In fact, if your children said, we don't want to come, you would be inclined to say, well, then just don't. Right? I mean, that's not going to bring me any joy. That's not going to bring me any happiness if you're here against your will and you don't want to be. Well, how do you think God feels? God would receive no joy and no glory from people who only served Him because they could not do anything but serve Him. He wants us to make that choice. But we need to realize that in that, the power of choice, we also can leave. And it's easier than you think. Do you know what it takes to leave God? You know what you have to do to leave God? Nothing. Nothing. You don't have to shake your fist in the face of God and yell obscenities at Him and curse Him and run off. You just do nothing, and eventually you will have left God and maybe not even realized it. Be careful. You don't have to do anything to leave God. This young man must have been surprised by how easily it was to leave. The second surprise must have been this: how far sin took him. How far sin took him. You see, because now he suddenly has money and he suddenly has freedom. And by the way, are there any two things that a man his age would love more than freedom and money? I mean, he suddenly has it all. And he launches off. Of course, he's got to leave home. And he goes into this foreign country and he's going to just really live it up and enjoy life. And he did. He did. If you look at verse 13, he leaves and he goes into this far country. But you know what happened. He squandered everything. Because, again, that happens. The money and his fool are soon parted. And suddenly he has nothing. And now things change. I mean, this story changes very quickly between verses 13 and verses 14. 13 and 14. Because it says now, when he had spent everything, there came a famine in the land. And he began to be in need, and he went and he actually found somebody who would pay him to feed his swine. And he was so hungry that he was actually envious of the pigs. When you reach the point in life that you are envious of pigs, it's safe to say you've officially hit rock bottom. By the way, don't miss the subtlety in this story. Jesus is speaking to a Jewish audience. Do you remember the Jewish view on pork from the old law and pigs and swine? What Jesus is saying, maybe that doesn't even ring in our mind because we aren't Jewish in background, is he's talking about a man who has now associated himself with an animal that was considered so unclean that you couldn't be near it, and if you were considered unclean. The picture Jesus is painting for us here is a man who has literally, absolutely hit rock bottom. He has nothing. The money is gone. The friends. Now, I'm assuming that when he was in this far country living it up, there were people around. People generally do that with other people of like-minded, but now where are they? Have you noticed the world's view of friendship? What can you do for me? And when you can't do for me, I'm out of here and you're on your own. He now needed something. When he had the money, they were there to live it up with him, but now that he doesn't have anything, he doesn't have anyone either. So the money's gone, the friends are gone, he's in a foreign country, he has no food, he's envious of pigs. Now, the day he left home, you think that's how he thought it would turn out? Anything but that. Anything but that. But you see, that's the problem. It's how far sin takes us. Someone has said that sin will always take you farther than you wanted to go and cost you more than you wanted to pay and keep you longer than you wanted to stay. Now, it's deceptive, and Satan's only power over us is deception. Satan can't force you to do anything any more than God will force you to do anything, but Satan's great tool is deception. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 25 is speaking about Moses. And it says of him that he chose to endure the afflictions with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Did you notice that? The Bible actually states there is pleasure in sin. I mean, God's honest. He's always been upfront with us, and He's not going to tell you any different about that. There is pleasure in sin. But you notice the last part of that, for a season. You say that pleasure doesn't last long. In fact, not only does that pleasure short-lived, it often leads to the opposite of pleasure. It often leads to misery, and it leads to trouble, and it leads to problems that you would not have had otherwise. And here is this young man, away from home, no money, no friends, no job, no food, and he's envying the pigs. You see, we can be deceived into thinking, well, I can dabble a little here and there, and I'll be all right, and it won't get to me. And you know, sometimes that could be true, and then suddenly we realize it's actually taken us farther than we ever meant to go. When Leonardo da Vinci was painting his famous piece, The Last Supper, he wanted to find someone who would just have the face, the most innocent, the most genuine face that he could find to represent Jesus. That's where he started the painting, with Jesus in the center. And so he went and he finally found someone who thought could model Jesus, and so he had that person sit in front of him. And from that, he began to paint the face of Jesus. Well, then he began to paint the ones next from middle out. And it was a long process. He finally got to the spot that would be filled with Judas, the betrayer of Jesus. And he wanted to find the most vile, suspect-looking person, the most sinful-looking person he could find to represent Judas. So he went into the dungeons and the prisons, and he found his man. And he brought him in and began to use his face for the painting of Judas. And while the man was sitting there, he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" He said, "I'm the one you used to paint the face of Jesus." But over a few years of sin that also landed him in prison, even his face had changed. This young man never expected that sin would take him where it took him, that it would cost him what it cost, and that it would stay as long as he did. But you see, that's the nature of it. And he must have been surprised by how far sin took him. Surprise number 3 for this young man must have been how easy it was to come back. So here he is now, and he's sitting in this pig pen, and he is envying the pigs, and everything is worse than he's ever imagined it would be. What does he do? Verse 17 of Luke chapter 15 says that he came to his senses. I like how Jesus phrases that. When he came to his senses. You ever had a time in life, and maybe not even a sinful situation, but you just realize, what am I doing? You ever had that? It's almost a forehead slapper. What am I doing? What was I thinking? Why am I? This is that young man. It says in verse 17, when he came to his senses, he thought to himself, there are people who work for my Father, not children, not heirs, but servants who are treated better than I have it. And they actually have bread. In fact, they have more than enough to eat. And so, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back home and I'm going to beg for a job. I'm going to beg for a job, because at least then I will have something to eat. I find it interesting when you look at verses 17 through 20. There are 2 things that seem to be the catalyst to bring him to his senses. The first one is the obvious, the pig pen. I mean, it is amazing how realistically we can view sin when we are in the pig pen. Here was a man who had gone from living high on the hog to living with the hogs. He had gone from the penthouse to the outhouse, so to speak. And suddenly, everything looked different. The pig pen made him realize, made him come to his senses. The second thing was the memory of a loving father. His father was so good and so kind that even his servants had more than enough to eat. I find that even today, in strictly a spiritual situation, the same 2 things will bring people back to God. The horribleness of sin and a loving Heavenly Father. There are those, and by the way, in a number this size, there are people here who know people who right now are at or near rock bottom because of the choices they've made. That's not the time to give up on them. That may actually be when they suddenly begin to realize, what am I doing? And they start coming to their senses. and then the memory of a loving Heavenly Father. That God will take us back even though we don't deserve it and even though we've sinned. We need to remind others, and we need to be reminded ourselves of the love of God. You see, it was thinking about how good His Father was, and especially compared to how bad sin is, that He came to His senses. That must have been a surprise, that He could go home. In fact, you'll notice in this passage, starting at verse 18, He works on His speech. Now, if you're going to go home and you're going to eat crow and you're going to have to beg for a job, you better have a good speech, right? He says, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go back and I'm going to say these words. Here's the speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. Now get that, because we'll come back to it in a minute. That's what He's going to tell His Father. I just want to be hired. And so He gets up and He goes to His Father. Surprise number 3, how easy it was to go back. Which brings us immediately to surprise number 4, and that is this, the welcome of His Father. Surprise number 4, he could not believe. I'm sure he must have been shocked, because even those of us who read this, well, we're surprised at the welcome of his Father. Verse 20, he's walking down the road, and guess what? The Father sees him from a distance. Now, you can infer what you'd like. You can just speculate that it just happened to be coincidence, that he just happened to be looking down the road, or that he had been constantly looking down the road, hoping that his son would come back. I suspect that's more of the case. And he sees him, and what does he do? Well, he walks out there, folds his arms, and starts a little lecture, right? Well, son, hope you've learned your lesson. By the way, any of us who have children been tempted to do something like that? It's not at all what he did, was it? That's what you would expect. I'm sure that's what that son expected. Maybe even worse. Maybe you've embarrassed us. Don't even come back here. Oh, you left out of here high and mighty with your pockets full. Why are you back here now? You want something? You would have expected that. He would have expected that. That's not at all what happened. In fact, just the opposite. He sees him and he runs to him. You know why? He felt compassion for him. He felt compassion for him. And he ran to him and he embraced him and he kissed him. And then, verse 21. Now again, the son has to be surprised. Now, have you ever been hugged by someone when you weren't expecting a hug? And they catch you when your arms are by your side? And you ever been hugged like that? Maybe when you were a kid, somebody hugged you and your arms were pinned and they just hugged you in your arms. That's what I imagine. Because he wasn't expecting a hug, but you hear his father's got his arms around him and he wasn't warned. And he still tries to go ahead with his little speech. The son says, verse 21, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And now, you know from verses 19 and 20, that's not the rest of it. That's not all of it. Because what he was going to say was, please make me one of your hired men. But he never got a chance. Because the father interrupted him. The father called out to his servants quickly. He's not even listening to this. The son is saying, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Not listening. He's not hearing that. Too busy celebrating. He calls out, please bring the best robe and put it on him and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet and bring the fatted calf. We are going to celebrate. Isn't that interesting? He never even got a chance to finish his little speech when the father says, let's party, let's celebrate, let us absolutely enjoy the fact that my son who was lost is now found. That's a surprise. I heard about a true story. A young man had chosen some really bad choice, made some really bad choices that landed him in jail. the pig pen. On the day he was to be released, his parents planned a welcome home party. I mean, they invited friends, they had balloons, they had cake and punch, and some well-meaning person said, "Aren't you afraid that's going to send the wrong message?" And he said, "It seems like I read somewhere where one time a father had a son come home and he threw a party too." But you see, the religious elites, they didn't understand that because they thought surely God hates sinners. No, the truth is God rejoices when a sinner repents. Now, that's the truth. But it must have been a surprise to this young man the way his father welcomed him home. Because when God forgives, He doesn't put that person on probation. There isn't some kind of a period of time where, okay, but I'm going to watch you for now, like we tend to do sometimes. When God forgives, He completely forgives. But the story isn't over. And that brings us to the final surprise that this young man experienced. And that is the response of his brother. The response of his brother is surprising, even for the reader. Because you see, up until now, this is an incredibly happy story, isn't it? I mean, don't you want this story to end right now? If this were a movie where they are bringing out that fatted calf, that's where the credits would start rolling, right? And you'd walk out of the theater feeling really good. But the story didn't end there. In fact, I think I can show that this final surprise, number 5, is actually where Jesus was going all along. The response of his brother was very much like these Pharisees and these spiritually elite people who thought that God hated sinners. Because look at now we're starting at verse 25. They're celebrating. This son is back. But now his older brother, you remember from verse 12 that he was the younger. But he has an older brother. And he heard the celebration. He heard the music and he heard what was going on. And so he goes and he asks, "What's going on here? I mean, we've got a celebration going on and music and eating and feasting." And verse 27, the father says to him, and you can imagine how happy the father was when he said it, "Hey, your brother has come home. We're happy. We've killed the fatted calf and we've done all of this because we are so thrilled that he's back," as the text says in verse 27, "safe and sound." And then verse 28, you can't believe what happened. It says in that verse, the older brother became angry. And we shake our head. What? I mean, this is a great story. The son has recognized the foolishness of his ways. He's come back. The father's happy. They're celebrating. And here's this old guy over here, mad as a hornet. And you wonder why. And you're surprised as well. And it says in verse 28, he was so mad he wouldn't even go in the house. I don't care if they do have music and food. I'm not going in here because that scoundrel is in there too. Verse 29, by the way, verse 29 is such a picture of the Pharisee of that day and time. He answered and he said to his father, "Look, for so many years I have been serving you," and catch this, I actually have this underlined in my Bible because it's such a ridiculous statement. "And I have never neglected a command of yours." Oh, are you serious? Here is a man, the age of a man, and he's actually going to say to his father, "I've never disobeyed you once." Anybody here willing to make the same claim? Yeah, I didn't think so. There's not a preschooler on the face of the planet who can make that claim. But you see, this was the idea, this was the mentality of the Pharisee of that day. We're God's elite. We haven't sinned. And God hates sinners. And He loves us. And God's lucky to have us, actually, because we are us. He was such a holy Joe. I mean, he was so holy, he had to put rocks in his shoes just to keep from floating all the way up to heaven every day. This older brother says, I don't even want to be in the same room with that guy. And by the way, he says, you've never given me a goat. Isn't that interesting? His brother has come back from the pig pen, and all he wants is a goat, a roasted goat. Talk about priorities all over the place. And then verse 30. Verse 30 is very interesting because he says this is the older brother still talking about his younger brother. This younger brother of yours, he has devoured your wealth with harlots. Oh, really? Now, how would he know that? You see, the older brother had not gone to the far country with his younger brother, so he wouldn't have witnessed anything. He's actually not even seen his brother since he came back, so he couldn't have talked about anything. How is it that he's speculating with such a surety what his brother had done while he was gone? You ever wondered that? What I think is he's speculating what he would have done if he had gone. By the way, we need to be careful of our criticisms because sometimes what Jim says about John says more about Jim than it does John. But this was the Pharisee of the day who thought God hated sinners. Going now into verse 31, the father says, but child, you've always been with me, and now, because he's taken his half, everything I have left is yours. We had to be merry and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. But the brother wasn't happy because he thought God hated sinners. Well, what a surprise. The prodigal faced. Can't believe how easy it is to leave. And yet anybody who wants to literally doesn't even have to do anything and they can leave God. But if they do, they're going to find out that what awaits them is not what they had hoped for or even anticipated. Now here's where you and I come into play. There are those who are still out there in the far country. I know in a number this size there are family members of yours who are in the far country. There are friends. There are members of this congregation who have fallen away. Maybe that we just somehow didn't notice. Maybe they fell through the cracks. And they're in the far country. Here's what we need to be doing is reminding them that they can come back and that the Father will welcome them. That's what we need to be doing. And what we need to make sure that we're not doing is acting like this older brother. Well, if he comes in, I'm just leaving. You know, with that attitude, I think God would say, well, just go ahead and leave because I can't use you anyway. You see, God rejoices. Just like that shepherd did when he found that sheep, and just like that widow did when she found that coin, and just like that father did when his son came home, God rejoices when sinners repent. That's the truth of how God feels about sinners. Today, maybe you need to make your life right with God. Maybe you've been tempted yourself and you've been taking steps toward the far country. Maybe you're not always there yet, but you know where that road heads. And you need to also know God allows U-turns. If you're on the wrong road, God allows U-turns as well. If you need to make your life right with God in some way, maybe you've never been baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, we encourage you to do that today. Whatever your need is this afternoon, take care of that right now while we stand and sing.